The night Agnes Whitmore pressed a damp cloth soaked in something that smelled of pine resin and something sharper, something Ruth could not name and would not have known to ask about, against little Eli's burning chest, the post-surgeon at Fort Hall was already writing in his ledger. Ruth did not know that yet. She did not know what the surgeon had written, or that the ink was barely dry, or that the words he had put down amounted to a quiet surrender she had never consented to. She was watching Agnes's hands move in the lamplight and trying to decide whether to stop her or let her work. That is where this story begins. Not at the Missouri River crossing, though we will get there. Not at the moment a letter arrived in the autumn of 1857 that changed the shape of Ruth Calloway's life, though we will get there too. It begins in a low-ceilinged room inside the walls of Fort Hall, Idaho Territory, on the 19th of August, 1858, with a mother who had run out of sanctioned options and a woman she barely knew making choices that no licensed physician was willing to make anymore. Ruth Calloway had been a widow for 14 months when she left Zanesville, Ohio in the spring of 1858. Her husband George had died of consumption the previous February. Slowly, in stages, the way that particular illness took people, as though it could not quite commit to the end. He was 34 years old. Their son, Elias, everyone called him Eli, had just turned 6. Ruth was 31. The farm was gone within 3 months of George's death. There were debts Ruth had not known about, obligations to a cousin in Chillicothe that George had handled quietly and never mentioned, the way men of that generation handled certain things, alone and silently, and with the assumption that it would not become her problem. The auction lasted one afternoon. A neighbor bought the milk cow. A man from 2 counties over took the better plow. Ruth stood by the fence with Eli on her hip and watched her marriage become currency, and then she went inside and wrote a letter to George's brother Samuel, who had gone to Oregon Territory 4 years before and was now, according to his last correspondence, farming 160 acres of bottomland in the Willamette Valley. Samuel's reply came in November. It was a practical letter, 3 paragraphs, no ornamentation. He had built a second cabin on the property. He had no wife and no plans to acquire one. He was offering Ruth the cabin, a half-acre kitchen garden, and a share of the harvest if she would cook and keep house through the first years. He was not a warm man, George's brother, but the letter was honest, and Ruth had learned by then that honesty in an offer was worth more than generosity in a promise. She had seen what promises looked like when the man who made them was gone. She told Eli they were going west. He asked if they could bring the rooster, which they had not owned since October. She said no, but maybe they'd find another one. He seemed satisfied with this. She joined the Hartley Company out of Independence, Missouri on the 14th of April, 1858. 22 wagons, 61 people. A wagon master named Dolph Hartley who wore the same weathered brown hat every day regardless of weather and who had made the crossing 4 times and spoke about it the way a man speaks about a job he respects but no longer fears. Ruth paid $60 for a place in the company, nearly the last of what the auction had left her, and packed her wagon with flour, bacon, dried beans, coffee, a cast-iron pot, 2 quilts, Eli's wooden horse, and a small Bible with George's mother's name written on the inside cover in handwriting that slanted sharply to the right, as though the letters were always leaning away from something. The prairie in April smelled of new grass and cold mud, and the particular sharpness of a world that has just thawed. The wagon wheels left tracks in ground that was still soft from the snowmelt, and the oxen moved with the careful, deliberate patience of animals that understood they were in for a long road. Eli walked beside the wagon for the first 3 days and collected rocks with the seriousness of a man with a purpose, presenting each one to Ruth for evaluation. She told him they were beautiful. She told herself they would find room for them somehow. By the 2nd week she was quietly releasing them back to the road when he fell asleep, and she felt guilty about this and then decided that guilt was not a thing she could afford to carry in addition to everything else. Agnes Whitmore joined the company 3 days out of Independence, when they were still moving through Missouri farmland and the road was still a road and not yet a rut worn into the earth by 10,000 wheels before theirs. She came from the south, her wagon small and efficiently loaded, pulled by 2 good mules named Patience and Doubt. She had named them herself and saw no reason to explain the choices to anyone who asked. She was 48 years old, though she looked older in some lights and younger in others depending on whether she was working or resting, and she had the particular quality of a person who has been through a great deal and decided not to let the great deal define every moment going forward. She had lost her husband, Levi, at the Platte River crossing in 1855. The current took their wagon, and Levi went into the water to save the oxen and did not come back up. She had turned around that year and made the long road back to Missouri and spent 3 years trying to determine whether she was done with Oregon or whether Oregon was simply unfinished business. She had eventually concluded it was the latter. She and Ruth became what might be called friends, though neither of them was particularly given to using that word easily or fast. They camped near each other most nights. Agnes taught Ruth which plants along the creek banks were useful and which would make a person sick in ways they wouldn't soon forget. Ruth shared her coffee, which was better than what Agnes carried, and in exchange Agnes shared her knowledge of the road ahead, which was worth considerably more than coffee. Eli liked Agnes, not because she was soft with him, she wasn't, but because she spoke to him directly, asked him real questions and listened to his answers, and children find that rarer and more interesting than most adults assume. The company reached Chimney Rock on the 22nd of June. It rose out of the Nebraska plain the way nothing that rises out of flat land should. Abruptly, impossibly, 470 feet of sandstone spire that everyone in the company had been told to watch for, and that still managed, when it finally appeared on the horizon, to stop conversation and make grown people stand very still. Eli pointed at it from the wagon for so long his arm must have ached. Ruth wrote in her diary that evening, "We saw it today. No description does it justice. Nothing does." Fort Laramie came on the 4th of July, the river bottoms green and the fort busy with the summer's stream of emigrants, and they rested 2 days and mended what needed mending and moved on. South Pass arrived on the 21st of July. 7,412 feet. The Continental Divide, the great turning point of the trail, and yet the crossing itself was deceptively gentle, a long gradual climb that eased into a wide sage-covered plateau where the air was thin and cool and smelled of nothing in particular. Several women in the company had been told that South Pass was the hardest part. They were relieved when it wasn't. Agnes said nothing about this. She had known that South Pass was not the hardest part. The hardest part was what came after. The Snake River Plain stretched out west of Fort Hall like the country had given up trying. It was a basin of black volcanic rock and alkali dust and a heat that sat on top of everything with no particular interest in moving. The water sources were unreliable. The good springs were miles apart. The bad ones, the alkali seeps that smelled of sulfur and turned white around their edges and killed cattle within hours of drinking, were everywhere, and you learned to watch your animals and to test what you weren't certain of, and to understand that the Snake River, which ran through the plain and looked like salvation, was treacherous at every ford and offered the appearance of abundance while hiding a current that moved like something that had made up its mind. The sound of wagon wheels on that volcanic plain was different from any other surface on the trail. A dry, rattling grind that worked its way into your teeth, nothing like the muddy suction of the river crossings or the smooth rolling of the Missouri grasslands. Everything on the Snake River Plain cost more than it should have. More water, more attention, more of the quiet determination that you had been spending for 3 months and that did not, it turned out, replenish as fast as it was spent. It was there, 10 miles east of Fort Hall, that Eli got sick. It began on the 9th of August, a Thursday. He was riding in the wagon, unusual because he generally preferred to walk alongside, collecting rocks and asking questions about them. Ruth noticed he was quiet and told herself he was tired. By midday he was asleep in a way that worried her, heavy and still where he was usually restless, his breathing more deliberate than sleep normally required. By evening he had a fever. She told herself it was the heat. She told herself children ran fevers and recovered. She had told herself versions of both these things before, when George was sick, and she had been right about the recovery until the night she wasn't, and the memory of being wrong that particular time made the current fear sharper than she wanted it to be. Agnes came to the wagon after supper and looked at Eli without touching him first, the way a person looks at something they are trying to understand before they disturb it. Then she felt his forehead and his neck and lifted one of his eyelids gently. She looked at the color beneath it. "How long?" she said. "Since midday," Ruth said. Agnes nodded. She didn't say what she was thinking, which Ruth recognized as either kindness or caution, and couldn't determine which. By the morning of the 10th it was not heat sickness. By the evening of the 10th it was not a simple fever. The boy's temperature climbed through the night, and his body stopped wanting water the way that was the first serious sign. Not thirst, but refusal. The illness making him turn his head from the cup. Ruth sat with him through those dark hours, and wetted his lips and talked to him, though he didn't always answer, and watched the canvas of the wagon lighten from black to gray to the pale yellow of early morning, and felt, very clearly, the particular weight of terror that does not shout but simply settles. Dolph Hartley moved the company to Fort Hall at first light. He made the decision the way he made all decisions, without ceremony. Fort Hall was 11 miles ahead, there was a post surgeon there, and they would make it by early afternoon if they moved. They made it by 2 o'clock. The post surgeon was a man named Dr. Marcus Harmon, thin, precise, somewhere in his early 50s, who had been at the post for 3 years, and had seen a great deal of trail illness in that time. He examined Eli without rushing, asked Ruth careful questions about water sources, diet, the timeline of symptoms. He was competent. She could see he was competent, and for a few minutes, standing in that examination room, she let herself feel something approaching relief. Then he sat down across the table from her and folded his hands, and she knew before he opened his mouth what the gesture meant. She had seen it once before, in a different room, with a different doctor, and a different person she loved lying on the other side of a thin wall. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "your boy has what I believe to be typhoid fever. I've seen 6 cases this summer along this stretch of the trail. The contaminated water sources on the Snake River Plain account for most of them." He paused. 2 of those 6 cases recovered. 4 did not. "Your son's fever has been running nearly 2 days and is very high. The next 48 hours will likely be decisive." He stopped. "The odds I can give you are not the odds you are hoping to hear." The room was very quiet. Outside, the fort continued. Horses, a hammer somewhere, men calling to each other in ordinary voices, the world proceeding at its usual pace as though it did not know it had just changed. "What are you doing for him?" Ruth said. He told her cold compresses for the fever, tincture of opium in small amounts to ease the cramping, broth if the boy would take it, rest, close monitoring through the night. "Is there anything else?" she said. He looked at her carefully. "There are things that have been tried," he said. "Willow bark preparations, various poultices. I cannot in good conscience recommend what I have no evidence for." A pause. "I can tell you what medicine knows, Mrs. Calloway. I cannot tell you more than that." She thanked him. She went outside. She stood in the afternoon sun of the fort yard, and breathed and did not allow herself to do anything else for the count of 30. Agnes was waiting by the wagon. Ruth told her everything. The diagnosis, the numbers, the doctor's careful honesty. She said it plainly, without breaking her voice, because breaking her voice was not a thing she could afford just yet. Agnes listened without interrupting, her expression the same throughout, not alarmed, not reassuring, just listening. "He's not wrong," Agnes said when Ruth finished. "He's telling you what he knows." "What do you know?" Ruth said. Agnes was quiet for a long moment. A man led a horse through the yard behind them. The sound of it faded. "I had a son," Agnes said. "His name was Daniel. He was 8 when we started for Oregon in 55. He took trail fever east of the Platte, not typhoid exactly, but a camp sickness, the kind that took children by degrees, from the inside out. The doctor we had said things much like your doctor," Harmon said, monitoring. "Odds. Comfort." She paused. "I didn't leave it at that." Ruth waited. "I did what my mother knew how to do, and what her mother knew before her. What most women who've lived close to the land and away from the nearest physician have always known, That medicine isn't only what men learned in school, and that knowledge passed down through women's hands is still knowledge, whatever they choose to call it. She looked at Ruth steadily. Daniel lived. He's 21 years old now. He farms in the Willamette Valley and writes me letters about his tomatoes. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the sound of a decision being made. "Tell me what you need," Ruth said. Agnes needed access to the edges of the fort where plants grew in the seams between the stockade walls and the dry ground. She needed time, and she needed Ruth to remain in that examination room in a way that made it clear she was the mother and the decisions ultimately were hers. Not by argument, just by presence. She worked through the afternoon. She gathered what she needed from the fort's margins and from her own wagon, where small cloth pouches hung in neat rows from a crossbar, each one labeled in her close, careful handwriting. From white willow bark, which she had carried since Missouri, knowing the trail would find occasion for it, she made a tea, strong and slightly bitter, that she tilted into Eli's mouth a few drops at a time. She made a second preparation from yarrow and pine resin that she would not have tried to explain to Dr. Harmon. It smelled sharp and alive, like something the forest had decided to give up. She showed Ruth how to soak a cloth in it and lay it on the boy's chest, and how long to leave it, and when to change it. She showed Ruth how to make a thin slurry of arrowroot that Eli could take when he refused the cup, tilted carefully into the corner of his mouth, a few drops at a time with a spoon turned sideways. She showed her what to watch for in the color of his lips and beneath his fingernails, the changes that meant the body was fighting, and the changes that meant something else. Dr. Harmon came to the room at dusk and looked at what Agnes was doing. He did not intervene. He looked at her for a long moment, and then at Ruth with an expression that was not unkind and not entirely convinced, and then he said quietly, "Call me if anything changes." He came back twice before morning. On the second night, the fever spiked. Agnes had said there would likely be a crisis point, a night when the body gathered everything it had and decided, one way or the other. Ruth had heard this and thought she understood it. She found, in the actual dark of that room, that understanding a thing and meeting it are entirely different. The boy's temperature rose until she could feel the heat coming off him before she touched him, and his breathing became shallow and rapid in a way that reminded her of George in those last weeks, the specific rhythm of a body working too hard to stay. She changed the cloth on his chest every 30 minutes. She tipped arrowroot slurry into the corner of his mouth and held her breath until she was sure he swallowed. She talked to him in a low, steady voice, not sentences exactly, just sound, her voice staying close to him the way you stay close to a person in the dark to let them know the dark is not all there is. Agnes came at 3 in the morning without being called and sat across the room and did not say a word. There was, in that silence, something Ruth would remember for the rest of her life. At 4:30 the fever broke. It did not break dramatically. There was no single moment. His breathing simply began to change, slower, then slower still, deepening into the particular sound of a child sleeping rather than a child struggling against something. Ruth pressed her hand to his forehead. The heat was there still, but it had softened, gone from something close to fire to something that felt by comparison almost ordinary. She pressed her face against the side of his head and held still. Across the room, Agnes exhaled. Eli slept until nearly 9. When he opened his eyes, Ruth was beside him, and he looked at her with the slightly confused expression of a person returning from somewhere very far away. "I'm hungry," he said. His voice was rough and thin. It was the most wonderful sound she had ever heard in her life. Dr. Harmon came at 10. He examined the boy carefully, and when he stood up he was quiet for longer than felt comfortable. Then he said, "Well," he looked at Agnes, who was standing in the doorway. Then he looked at Ruth. "The fever has broken. I'll want to watch him for another day before you travel. He'll be weak for a while yet. He'll need to ride in the wagon." He moved toward the door. Then he paused, exactly in the doorway where Agnes was standing, and she stepped aside, and he said, without turning around, "Mrs. Whitmore, would you be willing to show me what you used?" Agnes looked at him for a moment. "I would," she said. He nodded once. "Tomorrow morning, then." He was gone. The Hartley Company rested at Fort Hall for 4 days. It was longer than Dolph Hartley had planned, and he did not complain about it, because the news about the Calloway boy had moved through the company the way news moves in a small group of people who have been living very close together for 4 months. Quickly and with weight. People came to the doorway of Eli's room without coming in. They left things. A jar of preserved peaches, a small carved horse from the German family 2 wagons behind Ruth's, who had their own children along and understood without needing it explained. A folded length of calico from the woman whose wagon was nearest, tied with a piece of ribbon. There was a man in the company named Thomas Ware, a widower from Indiana, 39 years old, heading to Oregon to take up a land claim. He had said perhaps 24 words to Ruth directly in 4 months of travel. Not from coldness, she had come to understand, but from a particular kind of quietness that was its own form of attention. He had done things throughout the journey that she had noticed without categorizing, moved his wagon to give hers shade during a long noon stop, helped pull her oxen clear of a mud hole east of the Snake without being asked or thanked, left extra firewood outside her wagon on the coldest nights, never identifying himself. On the 3rd evening at Fort Hall, he came to the door of the room and asked how Eli was. Ruth told him. He asked if there was anything needed. She said no, they were all right now, she thought. He said good and turned to leave and then stopped. I'm glad, he said. He's a good boy. He said it the way a man says a thing he has been thinking about for a while, and finally located an occasion to say out loud. He is, Ruth said. Thomas nodded. He walked back toward his wagon. She watched him go. She wrote in her diary that night, I do not know what to make of him. I do not know that I need to yet. There is still a great distance left to cross. There was. The Blue Mountains in September, the final push through the Cascades, the descent into the Willamette Valley, all of it still ahead, and none of it easy. Ruth walked most of the mountain miles alongside the wagon because the grade was too steep for the oxen to pull full weight, and her boots wore through before they reached the valley, and she bound her feet with scraps of canvas from a flour sack and kept walking. Agnes was beside her for most of it. Eli, still not fully strong, rode in the wagon and called down reports on what he could see through the canvas opening. Thomas Ware's wagon stayed near hers through those last weeks, near enough to be useful and far enough to be respectful, and that distance said more than anything he could have put into words. They came down into the Willamette Valley on the 12th of October. The rain had started, and the air smelled of fir trees and wet earth and the particular richness of a place that had been waiting for you to understand what you were looking at. The green was not like Ohio green or Missouri green. It was a green that made everything east of the Cascades seem approximate. A rough draft of what color had been intending. Ruth stood at the edge of the road and looked at it. She had been afraid for a very long time, not only on the trail, before that too, longer than the trail. She had been afraid in the moment the auctioneer's voice stopped and the yard went quiet. Afraid in the months of winter in her sister's spare room while she waited for Samuel's letter. Afraid the morning she pointed the wagon west with 14 months of widowhood packed inside it, and told a 6-year-old boy they were going on an adventure because she had no better word for what they were doing. She had been afraid at Chimney Rock and at South Pass and on the Snake River Plain, and through 2 nights in a small room at Fort Hall, Idaho Territory, watching a small chest rise and fall and rise again. She was not afraid now. She could not have named exactly what she was feeling. Not happiness, not yet, or not only. Something quieter. Something like the moment after a very long effort when the body finally understands it is allowed to rest. Agnes came and stood beside her without saying anything. They looked at the valley together for a while. Well, Agnes said finally. There it is, Ruth said. Thomas Ware came up alongside them on his horse and stopped. He looked at the valley, then he looked at Ruth, and she looked at him, and neither one of them said anything, and that was all right. In the spring of 1859, when the rain stopped and the kitchen garden came in and Eli turned 7 and was entirely, emphatically, aggressively healthy, and had acquired a rooster whose name he had not yet settled on, Ruth wrote a letter to her sister back in Ohio. It was a long letter. She described the cabin and the land, and Samuel, who was as unsentimental in person as in correspondence but who had set aside a piece of the kitchen garden for her without being asked, which Ruth considered a language all its own. She described Agnes, who had taken land 3 miles to the north and was already known in that corner of the Willamette Valley as the woman to call when a child had a fever that wouldn't break. Word travels that way in a new place, through the people who have already been helped. She described Thomas Ware last, and she was careful about it. She was always careful about the things that mattered. He has land to the east of here, she wrote. He came for supper on Sunday. Ely showed him the rooster, who bites without warning and without apology. Thomas didn't mind. He asked if he might come again next Sunday. I said he might. She folded the letter, addressed it, set it on the table by the door for Samuel to take to town. Then she stepped outside into the April morning, where Eli was chasing the rooster across the yard with the focus of a person who has assigned himself an important and probably impossible task. And the mountains were still white at their peaks, and the valley was doing what it did in April, becoming everything, slowly, that it had always promised to be. She had crossed 2,170 miles to stand in that yard. She had buried a husband in Ohio, and an old life in Missouri, and a season of her deepest fear inside a fort in Idaho Territory, in a room that smelled of pine resin and yarrow, and the particular sharp scent of a woman's knowledge being put to use. She breathed in the morning. Let it fill her. In her diary later she wrote only this: "The rooster has no name yet. Eli is working on it. The mountains are there, the valley is there. We are here." That was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough.